Hi everybody, welcome back to Living Traditions Homestead. Well, it's kind of a crazy day here today. It has been hot and sunny and humid and rainy and sunny and rainy and then hot and humid. So it's been kind of a crazy day. I just actually had a downpour. I had to run into the sprout house before I could even start this video. But you guys, I wanted to talk with you about something pretty important today. Early in the mornings before the heat really gets hot here, I've been getting up and working in the garden for a couple of hours before we do our chores, before we do milking. And it's actually a really lovely time to be outside. But I've been starting to notice that I need to start fertilizing. There are a couple plants within our tomato plants that are probably half the size as some of our others. I'm not really sure what's going on, but to kickstart them, I'm going to fertilize them today. But not only do I need to just fertilize a few plants today, I need to start thinking about kind of long-term fertilizing for the rest of the summer. So today there are 3 different types of fertilizers that I'm going to make. One of them I can use today, the other 2 need to sit for a bit, but I thought today would be a perfect time for me to sit down with you guys, tell you about all 3 of the fertilizers that we will be using and how to go about making them. Now, 2 out of the 3 of them are absolutely free, and I absolutely love that, and so those are the 2 that I'm going to plan on using most for the rest of the summer. But they both need to sit for at least a couple of days, and I need to fertilize those tomato plants, and I'm going to fertilize the pepper plants today just because it needs to be done. The 3 fertilizers that we're going to be making together today are Comfrey Tea, rabbit manure tea, and then a fish fertilizer, the strength appropriate for kind of bigger plants. I've talked about using Fish Emulsion fertilizer with seedlings, but now the plants are bigger, so we can increase how much you add. It's kind of a bigger strength or a more potent strength, so we're going to do that today. But before we go ahead and get started making those compost teas, I want to talk to you a little bit about fertilizer and what plants need when and what they're going to need now. So plants really kind of go through about 3 different stages in the growth process. They are creating a lot of leaves, they are developing a strong root system, and then they flower and produce their fruit. So I really think of that as 3 different stages: growing leaves, developing a strong root system, and then growing their flowers and their fruit. So if you think about it that way, you'll better understand what they need at different stages. Now I just want to veer to the side a little bit and talk about fertilizers and their NPK. Now when you look at fertilizers, their packages and things, you'll see 3 numbers. You'll see, 13, 13, 13 or 5, 4, 5, that kind of thing. And that is the NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium number. And gardeners pay attention a lot to that because that will tell you how much nitrogen, how much phosphorus, and how much potassium is in that fertilizer. Now, in different growing stages, the plants need higher and lower numbers of that NPK. At first, when they're growing a lot of their leaves, they need a higher amount of nitrogen. But then as they're growing their root system and really developing as a plant underground, they need more phosphorus. And then as they put on their flowers and their fruits, they need more potassium. Now actually, both phosphorus and potassium help with flowers and fruits, but I've really tried to simplify it so maybe it's a little bit easier for you to understand when you just start getting into figuring out what fertilizer you need. Once you feel more comfortable with those numbers and the NPK, you can start looking at the different fertilizers that are out there to determine what your plants need and what you are comfortable using. We all want our gardens to thrive, so that's really why it's so important for you to understand the fertilizers, how they work, and the different numbers of the NPK. It's also important for us to understand those numbers because there are some times where too much of one thing is bad for them. For instance, when it comes to nitrogen, plants really need nitrogen to get lots of leaves and become healthy plants. But if we continue giving them a lot of nitrogen, that's all they'll create. So for instance, tomato plants. Tomato plants can really benefit from nitrogen right at the beginning. But if you continue giving them too much nitrogen, they'll only produce leaves. They won't produce blossoms and they won't produce fruit. So if that's something that you've experienced in the past where you've had the most gorgeous, bushy, tall tomato plants ever but never get any fruit, it's very possible that it's because you're giving them too much nitrogen and not enough phosphorus and potassium. So now that I've explained a lot of that and hopefully you've understood that, we can kind of move on to the rest of what we have to do together today. So the first thing that we're going to be doing together today is making comfrey tea. I've been growing comfrey on the homestead for several years, and comfrey is the most wonderful plant in the garden for fertilizing and for plant health and for making compost. It's just really wonderful plant. Comfrey plants are considered accumulators. They have deep, long tap roots that go way down into the soil, and they draw up tons of nutrients and minerals that other plants can't gather from the ground, but they still need those. Comfrey stores all of those nutrients and those minerals in their tubers and their roots, and then they put those up into their leaves and their stems and their flowers. And by using the comfrey leaves and their other parts to make compost, comfrey tea, or just to add that into the soil, it allows the other plants to get those nutrients that they need so badly, but they just can't get it because their roots don't go down that far. That's why comfrey is so perfect for this homemade fertilizer. Let's go over, take a look at some of my plants that I have. We're going to take a bunch of cuttings off of it so that we can turn it into fertilizer. There are many other wonderful things about using comfrey that I want to talk with you about, but let's get up before it probably rains again. Go get some comfrey, come back in the shade, and get started. Most of the comfrey that I have right now is in buckets. I actually have 3 of these big buckets that have comfrey in it. Now, I don't know what variety of comfrey I have. There are lots of different varieties, and I'll tell you that any variety will work fine to make comfrey tea. I got these actually from a neighbor down the road on the very first year that we moved to the homestead. I'm super grateful for it, but there are some varieties that can be very invasive. This doesn't seem to be one of those varieties, but just keep that in mind if you're ordering seed or getting some roots from somebody else, that some of them can become pretty invasive. One thing that I've found about working with comfrey is that because the leaves are, they're kind of fuzzy, but not in a good way, not in a soft way. They're kind of fuzzy like cucumber plants and squash plants, and that irritates my skin. So I need to work with gloves when I'm cutting them. These guys have gone to flower, and that's okay. I'm actually gonna cut this quite a ways back, almost down to the soil level. We're going to be using the leaves, the stems, and the flowers. So I am just cutting everything to about 4 to 6 inches above the soil level, and I'm just taking them by the handfuls like this. The dead leaves and brown leaves and stuff like that, you can either pull that off and not use it, but you could also just put it in with the tea we're going to be using. So I'm just putting that in a bucket for now, and I'm just going to keep on going. We are going to need to pick enough comfrey that when we chop it all up, it fills a bucket, whatever size bucket you're going to be using, up halfway. I'm using a 5-gallon bucket, so I'm going to cut quite a bit of comfrey. Now, comfrey is very resilient. Now, it is just going to bounce back from this big harvest. I don't have to worry about it at all. But if you're concerned about it getting stressed out after this, you can fertilize it with some comfrey tea or any other kind of fertilizer that you have, or another one that we're going to talk about today. I'm thinking that just one full plant's worth right here is going to do the trick. So let's go back into the shade and start pulling some of this apart, filling up the bucket, and we can talk a little bit more about why comfrey in particular is such a great thing to use to make fertilizer. Okay, back in the shade. It's much more bearable here. I'm still sweating, but it's better than being in the sun for sure. Okay, so we're back here with our cut comfrey. We're gonna rip it up, cut it up, or whatever the case, whatever works for you. And we're just gonna fill this bucket up halfway. And I wanted to talk with you about why comfrey is so good, even compared to the manure fertilizers, the fish fertilizer, and all of those other kinds of things. So what I want to tell you is that comfrey itself has a better NPK than any of the manures. It has more nitrogen, maybe comparable phosphorus, but just loads and loads of potassium. The reason why that's so important for me anyway is that right now my plants in the garden have had, most of them, except for the ones that I'm going to fertilize today because they're kind of not as big as my other ones, most of them are done needing a lot of nitrogen. They have developed their nice root base, and now I want to encourage them and help them put on flowers and grow their fruit. So potassium is what does that, and that's why I want something that's high in potassium. So comfrey is nice and high in potassium. The NPK for comfrey, the plants themselves, are just over 3, just over 1, and just over 8. So let's call it 318. Now, that's the plants themselves. When we combine them and let them basically ferment and mix with the water as tea, those numbers are going to go down. However, fertilizer in a liquid form is much more usable to the plants right away. The fertilizer, the comfrey, doesn't have to break down at all before it can enter into the soil and then be taken up by the roots of the plants that you're fertilizing. So even though we're not getting straight 318, we're getting a very rich, usable type of organic, natural fertilizer for our gardens. It's really going to be a wonderful thing. Another thing that's so wonderful about comfrey is that it doesn't just have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. It also brings up from the ground a ton of calcium, which is so important to prevent blossom end rot in both tomatoes and peppers, and actually eggplant, which I just learned. So that is very important. It's also very high in manganese and so many other micronutrients that our plants in the garden very much need and can't get on their own. Well, I figured almost perfectly, I think. Just one of those buckets full of the leaves and stems and stuff made about half of a 5-gallon bucket full of chopped up comfrey. I kind of smashed it down a little bit. So I'm going to fill this bucket up with water, and it's up to you whether you want to cover it or not. It doesn't really matter. Now, it's going to get nasty, okay? It's going to get brown and stinky and all of those kinds of things, and you should really wait 3 to 6 weeks to use it. If you're in a hurry, you can use it after a few days and you can use it full strength, but really it's going to be best if you let it sit for a long time, like 3 to 6 weeks, like I said. If you can wait that long, then you'll want to dilute it and use 1 part of the tea to 10 parts of the water. And you can use that as a drench on the soil. So just pour it right on the soil around your plants. They're going to love it. Now, this is what I intend to use for the rest of the summer on all of my plants because it has such a great amount of potassium in it. Has a little bit of nitrogen, which the plants still need, but they don't need a bunch right now. Has a little bit of phosphorus, and it also has so much of that calcium and those good bionutrients that the comfrey has brought up deep from the ground. This fertilizer can be used about twice a month on your garden plants. Okay, we're done with this one. I just have to put some water in it. And then we're going to move on to rabbit manure tea. Okay, on to rabbit manure tea. You know, rabbit manure is fantastic in the garden, but I also love it because it's another free way for us to make fertilizer. It's a byproduct of raising rabbits for meat, which we love to do and we've done on various scales throughout the last 10 years. Now, like I said before, the NPK values aren't quite as good as the Comfrey tea or as Comfrey, but I'll tell you what, that rabbit manure has the absolute best NPK out of all the manures. And you can see charts of that online if you search NPK manures. There are all these charts of all the different types of animal manures that you can use for garden fertilizer, and it will show you that rabbit manure is actually the very best. The other reason why rabbit manure is one of the best animal manures for the garden is that it doesn't have the salt content in it that other manures do, which is what makes it possible for you to use it right away without it having to be composted. It's considered a cold manure rather than a hot manure. So that is another fantastic reason why rabbit manure should be in your garden. Now, the NPK for rabbit manure is a little above 2, a little above 1, and just under 1. So like 2, 1, almost 1. Because rabbit manure has higher nitrogen than phosphorus and potassium, it is a little bit better for the early stages of your plant when it really needs that extra nitrogen to increase a lot of that foliage, which is why I switched to something like Comfrey tea when the plants are bigger. It's also why I'm using rabbit manure tea right now to stimulate my smaller plants into growing bigger and bushier, so then they can switch into concentrating on flowers and fruit production. So kind of similar to the way that we made the Comfrey tea, you know, basically Comfrey tea is comfrey and water, you let it sit. So same goes with rabbit manure. It's rabbit manure, water, and you let it sit. I'm going to be making kind of like a giant rabbit manure tea bag. I'm going to use an old towel. It's an old tea towel that is filled with stains and has kind of gotten yucky over the years. And I'm going to use about 1 gallon of rabbit pellets, rabbit manure, and then I'm going to fill up the rest of a 5-gallon pail with water. So I'm just going to pour this into here, make kind of a little pouch. Ooh, dusty. Make this into kind of a little pouch here. A giant poop tea bag. And then I have some just baling twine. You can use whatever you have around the homestead. Baling twine, we always have it around the homestead. I'm just gonna tie that up. Now, you don't have to use a towel like this or create a little pouch like this. You could really just dump the manure in the bottom of a bucket and fill it up with water. It's just that these are gonna decompose quite a bit and get really kind of like soft and mushy and kind of grody, and it's harder to kind of strain it out later on before you use it. So that's why I like to use this method. This needs to sit for at least 3 days. You'll want to dilute the water, the tea that comes from this, until it's like a light brown, and then you can use that as a drench. You can use it as a foliar feed in your garden, and you can probably use this more than once a week, but I would probably only use it once a week. Just that's my personal choice. So that's another easy, free way to make your own fertilizer at home. But I don't have 3 days to wait, and I don't have 3 to 6 weeks to wait. I need to fertilize my tomato plants, which aren't growing as fast as some of the others. I want to fertilize them today. So a quick and easy and pretty inexpensive way to do that is by using Fish Emulsion. Okay, the last fertilizer we're going to be talking about today, and the one I'm actually going to be using today, is Fish Emulsion. It's also called Fish Fertilizer. It comes in lots of different size containers. We buy it by the gallon, and it is wonderful. The NPK of this fish fertilizer, and it varies a little bit by brand, is 511. So there's quite a bit of more nitrogen in it than phosphorus and potassium, which means that this is going to be good for the leaves and getting these plants up and started and going. Only a little bit for the roots, only a little bit for the flowers and the fruit. So because I need to get those tomatoes up and running, just those few plants that aren't as big as the others, I'm going to put down some fish emulsion. So this fish fertilizer or fish emulsion for seedlings, which is I use fish fertilizer only on my seedlings. I use 1 tablespoon per gallon of water to fertilize seedlings. But once they're a little bit more mature and they make it out into the garden, you can increase that to 2 tablespoons per gallon of water. So I am probably only going to need maybe 2 or 3 gallons today to water just the few plants that I have. Like I said earlier, I'm also going to do the pepper plants just to give them another good start. So I'm going to I'll do 6 tablespoons, and I'm not going to measure. I think I can eyeball it. So 1, 2, 6. We'll fill that up to about 3 gallons of water and mix it up, and that'll be good to go. Fish fertilizer you can use up to 2 times a week on your plants in the garden. Less than that would be fine also. With the fish fertilizer, you're probably going to want to use all of what you made that day. If you've made too much, then just go pour it on some of your other plants or your trees or whatever, your flowers. The rabbit manure tea you can probably keep around for a couple weeks if you have to. That's probably going to be better used as soon as you make it or as soon as it's ready. But the Comfrey tea, because it's going to take so much longer for you to make, before you can use it, and because you're probably going to be having a bigger quantity than you need since you dilute it so much, it's actually good for up to 10 months. But you may want to cover it so that it doesn't grow any nasties or anything like that. Okay, so I just need to put some water in here, and then we'll head out to the garden to water and fertilize a few things that need an extra little boost. You can see how nice and full some of these tomato plants are. They are looking beautiful. But we just have a few that haven't quite had the same vigor as those. So I'm going to go ahead and fertilize these guys. Just using a cup. Giving them some. Now it's rained, so they've had plenty of water. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with some of these little pepper plants. I just want to give them a boost. Now you guys can see our drip irrigation here. It does so well for us. We are looking for a way to fertilize our entire garden all at once by using the drip irrigation. We're looking for some kind of inline drip irrigation system that will flood this whole area with the fertilizer that we want. We're on the lookout. We are going to be ordering some to test them out. And when we find something that we really like, we'll make sure to share it with you guys. But we just don't want to try something and share it with you and then have it end up being, junky or not working or, not worth the money and that kind of thing. So as soon as we can find an effective solution for this through the drip system, we'll let you know. Well, we covered a lot of ground here today, you guys, all about the fertilizers that you can use at home. Now, all 3 of these that I talked about today are organic ways to fertilize, either free or very inexpensive, and they're all very, very effective. I hope that you try all of them. And I hope that I explained the whole fertilizer NPK thing in a way that makes sense to you and that is helpful for you so that you can use that knowledge later on in your gardening. You guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure that you give it a thumbs up. That does help us. Don't forget to subscribe so that you're notified of all of our new videos. And as always, if you found this video helpful. The best way that you can help us is to share this video on all your social media. This is a really important topic in gardening season, and I think that it could help other people. So make sure that you spread the word. We would appreciate it. Until next time, guys, thank you so much for stopping by the homestead and spending some time with me. Take care, and God bless.